41 skeletal goats stood trembling in the blistering sun, abandoned by a man who laughed as he pocketed exactly 4 crumpled dollar bills. He thought he was handing over a graveyard. He didn't know those dying animals were about to produce the most coveted, impossible cheese in agricultural history. Heat waves shimmered like broken glass across the cracked, barren earth of the San Joaquin Valley. It had been 18 months since the last meaningful rainfall, and the historic drought had turned once lush dairy pastures into desolate stretches of baked clay. Century-old family farms were folding by the week, their cattle sold off at pennies on the dollar, their fields repossessed by ruthless regional banks. Clara Higgins leaned against the rusted tailgate of her 1998 Ford pickup, wiping a mixture of sweat and grit from her forehead. Her family had worked the Whispering Pines dairy for 4 generations, but the drought cared nothing for legacy. Her wells were sucking mud. Her feed silos were echoing and empty. She was exactly 30 days away from a foreclosure auction that would wipe her family's name from the county map forever. Across the dusty holding pen stood Aldrich Perez. Aldrich was a man who thrived on the misery of his neighbors. But while other farmers scrambled to share diminishing water rights, Aldrich had spent the last decade quietly buying up upstream access and leveraging the local agricultural board to his advantage. He didn't just want to survive the drought. He wanted to use it to consume every vulnerable farm in the valley, and Clara's prime acreage, which sat directly over a deep, untapped artesian aquifer, was the crown jewel he had been lusting after for years. Aldrich had diversified into artisan goat farming a few years prior, importing a massive herd of purebred French Alpines and Nubians to capitalize on the lucrative organic dairy market. But the drought had hit his operations too. Without cheap water to grow lush alfalfa, his goats were starving. Instead of spending his vast fortune to import seed from out of state, Aldrich decided to cut his losses in the most malicious way possible. "Look at them, Clara," Aldrich sneered, leaning against the pristine fencing of his holding corral, a freshly lit cigar clamped between his teeth. "They're walking corpses. Animal control is breathing down my neck, and the livestock disposal fee at the county dump is $200 a head. I'm a businessman, not a charity. I'm liquidating." Clara stared through the wire mesh. The sight made her chest ache. 41 goats were huddled together in the meager shade of a dying oak tree. Their ribs protruded sharply against dull, patchy coats. Their eyes were sunken, glassy and devoid of life. A few were already lying in the dirt, their breathing shallow and erratic. They were magnificent animals, or they had been. Now, they were just another casualty of the relentless sun. "Why call me down here, Aldrich?" Clara asked, her voice raspy from the dry air. "You know I'm broke. I had to sell my last 20 Holsteins a month ago just to keep the bank from chaining my front gate. I can't buy your herd." Aldrich smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of his lips. "I'm not asking you to buy them at market value, Clara. I'm offering you a miracle. You have empty barns. You have that useless, rocky ridge on the back of your property. Take them. Maybe you can nurse a few back to health. Maybe they'll give you enough milk to stall the bank." Clara narrowed her eyes. Aldrich Perez never offered miracles. He laid traps. She quickly did the math in her head. 41 goats, starving and severely dehydrated. If she took them, they would likely die on her property within 48 hours. The county law mandated that any farmer with dead livestock on their land had to pay the mandatory environmental disposal fee to prevent groundwater contamination. $200 a head for 41 goats was $8,200. A fee she couldn't pay. A fee that would result in an immediate county line on her property, triggering an accelerated foreclosure. Aldrich didn't want her to save the goats. He was using her land as a free graveyard to dodge his own disposal fees. Knowing the resulting fines would be the final nail in her farm's coffin, he would be there at the courthouse steps the very next morning, buying her grandfather's land for a fraction of its worth. "You're a monster," Clara whispered, the realization settling like a stone in her stomach. "I'm a pragmatist," Aldrich corrected, flicking cigar ash onto the dry earth. "I'll write up the bill of sale right now. I'll make it entirely legal. You can have the whole herd for $1 a head." Clara turned to walk away. She was desperate, but she wasn't foolish. Yet as she pivoted toward her truck, a sound stopped her. It was a faint, raspy bleat. She looked back. A large, beautiful alpine doe with a coat like burnt caramel had managed to push herself up from the dirt. The doe walked on trembling legs toward the fence line, stopping directly in front of Clara. The animal raised her head and pressed her dry, cracked nose against the wire. Despite the starvation, despite the impending death, there was a fierce, undeniable intelligence burning in the doe's amber eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated defiance. Clara recognized that look. It was the same look she gave the bank manager every Monday morning. Something reckless and wild snapped inside Clara's chest. The valley had taken everything from her. The drought had taken her cattle, her savings, and her sleep. But she would be damned if she let Aldrich Perez take the lives of these animals just to save himself a tax bill. Clara reached into the front pocket of her worn denim jeans. She pulled out a crumpled wad of single-dollar bills, the last of her cash, meant for a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread at the town grocer. She flattened the bills against her thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4. "I don't have $41, Clara said, her voice ringing out with sudden, terrifying clarity. "I have $4 for the entire herd, Aldrich. Write the bill of sale for $4, or you can dig 41 gravies yourself." Aldrich threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that startled the dying herd. $4? You're buying your own bankruptcy for the price of a cheap cup of coffee, Clara. But fine, a deal is a deal. He scrawled the numbers onto a carbon copy livestock transfer form, signed it, and shoved it through the fence. Clara handed him the 4 crumpled bills. As Aldrich walked away, chuckling to himself about his brilliant real estate maneuver, Clara unlatched the heavy iron gate of the pen. She walked among the skeletal animals, dropping to her knees in the dust next to the caramel-colored doe. "All right, girls," Clara whispered, her hands trembling as she stroked the doe's bony neck. "He thinks we're already dead. Let's prove the bastard wrong." Transporting 41 dying goats across the valley took Clara 5 agonizing trips in her beat-up Ford. The town watched in bewildered silence as her truck rattled down Main Street, the bed loaded with limp, bony bodies. Word spread faster than a brush fire. The regulars at the local diner shook their heads, whispering that the stress of the drought had finally cracked Clara Higgins's mind. By midnight, the last goat was unloaded into the cavernous, empty dairy barn of Whispering Pines. Clara had laid down the last of her clean straw, creating a massive, soft bedding area. But the barn was eerily silent. Healthy goats were chaotic, vocal, and endlessly curious. These goats simply collapsed where they were placed, too weak to even lift their heads toward the water troughs. Headlights swept across the barn walls. Clara stepped out into the warm night air to see a battered Subaru pulling into her driveway. Out stepped Dr. Harrison Reed, the valley's retired large animal veterinarian. Oh, Harrison was a gruff man in his late 60s, with a thick silver beard and hands scarred from decades of pulling difficult calves. He had been a close friend of Clara's father, and though he had officially retired 3 years ago, he still kept his medical bag stocked. "I heard the rumors," Harrison said by way of greeting, slamming his car door. "Ochiki." He marched past Clara into the barn, pulling a heavy flashlight from his belt. He moved silently among the herd, shining the beam into their eyes, pressing his fingers against their sunken rumens and checking their pale, dehydrated gums. With every goat he inspected, his shoulders sank a little lower. Finally, Harrison turned off the flashlight and sighed, wiping a hand across his tired face. "Clara, what have you done?" "They're ghosts. Aldrich starved them past the point of no return. Their rumens have shut down. Even if you had a silo full of premium alfalfa, their stomachs can't process it anymore. If you give them solid food now, it'll bloat them and kill them faster. You need to call the renderer tomorrow. I'm sorry, kid. I'm not calling the renderer, Harrison, Clara said stubbornly, crossing her arms. Tell me how to restart their stomachs. Harrison stared at her, seeing the manic desperation in her eyes. He knew better than to argue with a Higgins. Electrolytes, warm water, molasses, and a pinch of baking soda, administered by syringe directly to the back of the throat. Every 2 hours around the clock. If you can get them hydrated enough, you might be able to introduce a handful of easily digestible forage in a few days. But Clara, you don't have any forage. The valley is dead. I'll find something, Clara said. For the next 72 hours, Clara did not sleep. She lived in the dirt of the barn. Armed with a massive 60cc veterinary syringe, she crawled from goat to goat, gently prying open their jaws and slowly depressing the plunger, forcing the warm, sugary electrolyte mixture down their throats. Her knees bruised, her back screamed in agony, and her hands cramped into agonizing claws. By the dawn of the 4th day, a miracle occurred. The caramel-colored doe, whom Clara had named Clementine, pushed herself up onto her hooves, let out a demanding bleat, and urinated. It was the most beautiful sound and sight Clara had experienced in 18 months. Soon, others followed. The hydration was working. The goats were standing, their eyes losing the glassy sheen of death. But now came a far more dangerous problem. They were ravenously hungry, and Harrison was right. Oh, Clara had absolutely nothing to feed them. Her pastures were nothing but cracked dirt and invasive toxic pigweed. Desperate, Clara walked out to the back of her property, just as the sun crested the mountains. Whispering Pines was bordered on its eastern edge by a towering, jagged limestone formation known locally as the Devil's Spine. It was a steep, treacherous ridge of sharp rocks and deep ravines. Her family's cattle had never been allowed near it, as cows were clumsy and prone to breaking their legs on the unstable shale. But as Clara stared up at the ridge, she noticed something she had missed her entire life. Driven by the severe drought, the surface soil in the valley had died. But up on the Devil's Spine, growing out of the deep limestone fissures, were massive patches of a strange, silvery green vegetation. It was an ancient, deep-rooted variety of wild mountain sage, intertwined with a rare, drought-resistant coastal fennel that had somehow migrated inland decades ago. Because the ridge was cast in shade for half the day, and because the limestone trapped deep subterranean condensation, this bizarre, hardy brush was thriving. Cows couldn't eat it. It was too bitter, too woody, and too high up. But goats? Goats were designed for the mountains. Goats were browsers, built to digest tough, aromatic brush that would kill other livestock. Clara ran back to the barn. She opened the large bay doors. "Come on," she yelled, slapping her thigh. "Come on, girls, walk." It took an hour to coax the weak, hesitant herd out into the sunlight. Clara led them slowly across the cracked pasture toward the towering shadow of the Devil's Spine. As they reached the base of the rocks, Clementine lifted her nose to the wind. The doe's ears perked forward. With a sudden, surprising burst of agility, Clementine bounded up the first steep shale embankment, navigating the treacherous rocks with genetic perfection. The rest of the herd followed. Clara watched in absolute awe as the 41 goats spread out across the vertical cliff face. They descended upon the wild sage, the bitter fennel, and the deep-rooted rock clover like a plague of locusts. They stripped the tough, aromatic bark. They devoured the silvery leaves. Their intricate, multi-chambered stomachs, recently restarted by the electrolytes, handled the intense, volatile oils of the wild plants with ease. For 3 weeks, the goats lived on the ridge. They grew stronger by the day. Their coats regained a healthy, oily luster. The hollows of their ribs filled out with hard, lean muscle. And then, something impossible happened. Clara was walking among them, checking their progress, when she noticed Clementine's udder was swollen, tight, and heavy. The wild, nutrient-dense, highly aromatic forage was triggering lactation. Clara rushed the doe back to the milking parlor, hooked her up to the dusty vacuum machine, and watched, in breathless silence, as a thick, creamy, pale yellow liquid hit the glass measuring jar. It wasn't a lot, barely half a gallon, but the smell that filled the parlor was intoxicating. It smelled like toasted almonds, wild herbs, and sweet cream. Clara dipped a finger into the raw milk and tasted it. Her eyes widened. It was the most complex, rich, and extraordinary milk she had ever encountered in her 30 years on a dairy farm. The wild botanicals of the devil's spine had infused directly into the butterfat. Clara knew right then she wasn't just going to survive, she was going to make a cheese that would change the world. But across the valley, Aldrich Perez was not a man who let things go. He had driven past Clara's property, expecting to see buzzards circling the barn. Instead, he saw a vibrant, healthy herd navigating the high rocks. He saw Clara laughing as she carried a heavy stainless steel milk pail toward her processing room. Aldrich's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He had sold her a gold mine for $4, and his pride could not handle the humiliation. He picked up his cell phone and dialed the direct number of the regional agricultural inspector, a man whose pocket Aldrich had been lining for years. "I need to report a severe violation at Whispering Pines Dairy," Aldrich said coldly into the receiver, his eyes fixed on Clara's farm. "Clara Higgins is illegally grazing sick, diseased livestock near a protected watershed. Machine, I want her shut down. I want those animals seized, and I want her off that land by Friday." Gravel crunched aggressively under the heavy tires of a White County truck as it tore down the driveway of Whispering Pines Dairy. Clara was in the milking parlor, gently detaching the vacuum cups from Clementine's udder when she heard the slamming of car doors. She walked out into the blinding midday glare to find two men blocking her path to the barn. One was a sheriff's deputy, looking uncomfortable in the heat. The other was Inspector Warren Higgins, no relation to Clara, much to her family's eternal disgust. Warren was a notoriously corrupt official on the Regional Agricultural Board, a man whose pockets were lined with Aldrich Perez's money. He held a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Clara Higgins," Warren barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "I have a sworn affidavit claiming you are harboring diseased, dying livestock and illegally grazing them on the Devil's Spine watershed. That's a Class A environmental hazard. I'm here to seize the animals and condemn the property." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. If they took the goats, it was over. "They aren't diseased, Warren. They were starved by Aldrich Perez and I saved them. And the Devil's Spine isn't a protected watershed. The aquifer is 300 feet below the limestone." "I don't care about your geological theories," Warren sneered, stepping forward to slap a bright red condemnation sticker on her barn door. "The trucks are on their way. We're taking the herd to the county incinerator. You touch one of those animals, and I'll have your state veterinary license suspended before sundown." A gruff voice echoed from the shadows of the barn. Dr. Harrison Reed stepped into the sunlight, his silver beard bristling with fury. He held up a thick manila folder. "I am a licensed doctor of veterinary medicine, Warren. I have been examining this herd twice a day. I have drawn blood, tested for pathogens, and documented their recovery. They are in perfect, miraculous health. Furthermore, I pulled the county zoning maps this morning. The protected watershed boundary ends exactly 40 yards west of the limestone ridge. Clara's goats are entirely within her legal property line." Warren's face flushed a deep, ugly purple. "Aldrich told me." "Aldrich Perez is a liar," Harrison interrupted, taking a menacing step toward the inspector. "And if you try to illegally seize a healthy herd without a state-sanctioned warrant, I will personally call the federal agricultural ombudsman and demand a full audit of your bank accounts to see exactly how much Perez is paying you. Get off this farm." The deputy, wanting no part of a federal investigation, quickly backed away toward the truck. Warren glared at Clara, his eyes narrowed into slits. "You have exactly 6 days until the bank forecloses, Clara. You can't milk 40 goats fast enough to pay off a $60,000 mortgage deficit. You're delaying the inevitable." As the county truck sped away in a cloud of dust, Clara leaned against the barn, her legs shaking. Warren was right about the money. The milk was extraordinary, but raw, fluid milk sold for pennies. She needed a miracle, and she needed it fast. "We don't sell the milk," Clara said suddenly, her eyes locking onto Harrison. "We make cheese." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Clara, artisan cheese takes months to age. You have 6 days. My grandfather used to make a washed-rind alpine cheese in the old limestone caves beneath the property," Clara explained, her mind racing. "It's a rapid aging technique. The caves maintain a perfect 50-degree temperature and 90% humidity. If I use a high rennet concentration and wash the rinds in a heavy brine infused with the wild sage from the ridge, the bacteria will aggressively metabolize the milk fats. I can force a partial cure in 5 days. It won't be fully aged, but it will be a soft, ripened, spreadable phenomenon." For the next 5 days, Clara did not see the sun. She moved the entire operation underground into the forgotten, damp stone cellars her great-grandfather had carved out of the earth a century ago. She worked with feverish intensity, heating the rich, herbal milk in massive copper vats, expertly cutting the curds by hand and pressing them into small, wheel-shaped molds. Every 12 hours, she took a bucket of heavy salt water, threw in crushed bundles of the wild mountain sage and coastal fennel the goats were eating, and rigorously scrubbed the outside of the cheese wheels. The hostile, hypersaline environment killed off bad molds while encouraging a distinct, fiery orange bacterial rind to form. By the 5th night, the eve of the foreclosure, Clara sat exhausted on a wooden stool in the cave. Before her sat 40 small, wrinkled wheels of cheese. They looked rough, rustic, and slightly intimidating. She pulled a pocket knife from her jeans and sliced a wedge from the center of a wheel. The inside was a gooey, pale gold paste. Clara placed it on her tongue and closed her eyes. The flavor was a revelation. It hit first with a sharp, salty tang, instantly followed by the deep, rich creaminess of the high butterfat. But the finish was what made it a masterpiece. The wild botanicals of the devil's spine erupted on her palate. Notes of toasted pine nuts, cracked black pepper, wild fennel, and a sweet, earthy musk that perfectly captured the untamed spirit of the San Joaquin Valley drought. It was aggressive, elegant, and entirely unique. She named it Devil's Crown. "It's the best thing I've ever tasted," Harrison said quietly, stepping into the cave and taking a piece for himself. "But, Clara, there isn't a market in this town that will pay you the thousands of dollars you need for it by tomorrow morning." Clara smiled, a fierce, determined gleam in her eyes. "I know. That's why we aren't selling it in this town." Morning broke over the valley with a suffocating, dry heat. Inside the air-conditioned lobby of the First Regional Agricultural Bank, Aldrich Perez sat in a leather chair, sipping a complimentary espresso. He wore a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the desperate, dirt-stained farmers who usually occupied the waiting room. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bank manager, a nervous, balding man named Richard Evans, stepped out of his office holding a stack of foreclosure documents. "Well, Richard," Aldrich said, standing up and smoothing his tie, "let's get this over with. I have the cashier's check ready for the Whispering Pines deed. A tragedy about the Higgins family, really, but progress marches on." Before Richard could speak, the heavy glass doors of the bank swung open. Clara strode in, wearing her clean, albeit faded, Sunday dress. She was flanked by Dr. Harrison Reed, who carried a large, insulated silver cooler. Aldrich chuckled. "Oh, Clara, please, don't make a scene. The auction is closed to the public. You missed 3 payments. The farm is mine." "I haven't missed my final deadline yet, Aldrich," Clara said, stopping in front of the manager's desk. "I have until 10 a.m. to clear the deficit." And how exactly are you going to pay $60,000? Aldrich sneered, stepping closer. "You have exactly $4 to your name. I know, because I took it from you." "She's not paying it," a new voice announced. The doors swung open again, and a man walked into the quiet bank lobby. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal blazer and dark jeans. The tellers gasped. Anyone who watched the Food Network or read international culinary magazines recognized him instantly. It was Chef Thomas Montgomery, the owner of a 3-Michelin-starred restaurant empire in San Francisco and a notoriously ruthless culinary investor. Aldrich blinked in confusion. "Who the hell are you?" Chef Montgomery ignored him, walking straight up to Clara and removing his sunglasses. "Miss Higgins, Harrison drove through the night to bring me a wheel of your devil's crown at 2 in the morning. He barged into my kitchen while I was prepping for a private gala. I was furious." Clara held her breath, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Then," Chef Montgomery continued, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "I tasted it. I have traveled to the most remote monasteries in the French Alps. I have tasted cheeses aged in volcanic ash in Italy. But I have never, in my 30 years in this industry, tasted a terroir as profound, violent, and beautiful as the cheese you produced on that limestone ridge. It is a masterpiece forged by Drought." He turned to the bank manager and pulled a sleek leather checkbook from his breast pocket. "I am purchasing the exclusive national distribution rights to the Devil's Crown from my restaurant group. The advance is $150,000, payable immediately. Will this clear Ms. Higgins's debt?" Richard Evans, sweating profusely, rapidly stamped the foreclosure documents with a massive red void. Yes, Mr. Montgomery. Her farm is completely paid off. The deed remains with the Higgins family." Aldrich's face contorted into a mask of pure shock and fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "This is a joke. You made cheese from starving, dying animals. I sold you those animals for $4. They were worthless." Clara stepped right into Aldrich's personal space. The scent of wild sage and hard work clung to her clothes, overpowering his expensive cologne. "They weren't worthless, Aldrich. You just didn't know how to fight for them," Clara said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 100 generations of stubborn farmers. "You thought the drought was a weapon you could use to break us. But the drought forced those goats up the mountain. It forced them to eat the hardest, toughest brush in the valley. The struggle is exactly what made the milk so valuable. You gave me the keys to my kingdom for $4. Aldrich stood completely speechless, humiliated in front of the entire bank staff. He spun on his heel and stormed out, shoving his way through the glass doors. But his nightmare was only beginning. Chef Montgomery's massive investment drew national media attention to the San Joaquin Valley. When investigative journalists arrived to cover the miraculous story of the $4 goats, they also uncovered Aldrich Perez's illegal water hoarding schemes and his bribery of Inspector Warren Higgins. Within 6 months, Aldrich was indicted on federal fraud charges, and his massive corporate dairy empire was dismantled and sold for scraps. Back at Whispering Pines, the drought eventually broke. Heavy winter rains washed over the Devil's Spine, but Clara never let her goats graze the lower pastures again. Every morning, Clementine and the rest of the herd bounded up the jagged limestone rocks, feasting on the bitter sage and wild fennel. Clara Higgins built a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled aging cave right into the side of the mountain. She hired 10 local farmhands who had lost their jobs during the drought, paying them double the county average. And framed in the center of her massive new processing room, right above the copper vats, were 4 crumpled, stained $1 bills, a constant reminder that the greatest treasures are often found right at the edge of absolute ruin. Did this incredible story of survival, grit, and the ultimate underdog victory give you chills? Clara's fight to save her farm proves that true value isn't defined by what others throw away, but by the relentless passion we pour into saving it. If you loved the tale of the Devil's Crown and those resilient $4 goats, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a miracle today, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life farming dramas.